also think about, the number of leading designers, both fashion designers in general, and more specifically button designers, who were inspired to work with Casein. And the first one that I want to mention is Miss Chanel, and her famous little black dress. And I, to be honest, didn't know the history of the little black dress, or the fact that when it was first designed, it was called Chanel's Ford. And the joke was that it was just like a Model T. It came in any color you wanted, as long as your color was black. So the idea that Chanel had was that she wanted to make a very simple, very basic dress that every woman could have in her closet, every woman could afford, and then every person could individualize it with the accessories, and especially with costume jewelry, again, so that every woman could be fashionable with a small budget. And we can see that the Chanel little black dress was first published on the cover of Vogue magazine in November of 1926. And Chanel did continue using Casein in her accessories. I'm not 100% sure about buttons, but she did have a long love affair with Casein as a material. This necklace was sold in Paris in 2014 with mother of pearl and Casein beads, and then the pearl flowers have little black glass centers. Sadly, these were not dated, so I'm not sure when this necklace was made for Chanel, but it's definitely Chanel. I mean, here we have probably a more modern bracelet made of Casein with the famous Chanel monogram logo. And it's quite possible that this was made because as I was researching, I read that all or almost all of Chanel's Casein accessories are made in a workshop in a town called Plailly, which is in the Pays de Tel. So they have finally made the conversion, and the few high-end luxury workshops that do these projects for designers are still centered in that region, or at least this one that works with Chanel is very much in that area still. So that's Chanel's. And as I was reading about Chanel, I kept coming across a name I had never heard of, which was Jacob Bengal. And if any of you are vintage jewelry fans, you probably think I must have been living under a rock, that I never heard of this guy. But he was one of these people who was really inspired by Chanel to explore these new materials and to use them to create costume jewelry. But when we look particularly at this necklace, and we see these laminated Casein, I guess you would call them beads, on the necklace, really, if you put a sewing hole through the bottom there, that could be a Casein button, like the ones we saw on that Art Deco card that I showed a moment ago. So he was a really big proponent of using Casein to create affordable fashion accessories for the period. So I mentioned also that many button designers were inspired to work with Casein, and of course, when I talk about button designers, I have to talk about Henri Hamm, who just inspires me. His work always surprises and delights me every time I see something. And so I definitely wanted to include him in this presentation. But if you've read Loïc Allio's 2 books, there was an article in the NBS Bulletin not so long ago, a few years ago now. A lot has already been said and written about Henri Hamm. So I was not 100% sure at first how I was going to manage to shoehorn him in here. But I know, when you're talking, for me, when you're talking about Casein and important artists and designers who work with Casein, you have to talk about Henri Hamm. And so, sometimes serendipity is a wonderful thing. It occurred to me that not so long ago, actually, there was this fantastic auction in Paris. That was the dispersal of the Stéphanie de Villefranche collection. Now, she was someone who had inherited a button collection that went back generations. And she had wanted for years to open a button museum in her chateau, and that never actually happened. And her heirs decided that they couldn't keep the collection and it had to be sold. And the collection, because, you know, as her name suggests, and the fact that I mentioned that she lived in a chateau, uh, her family came from the French nobility. And so their button collection going back all of these generations mostly focused on livery buttons. But Stephanie herself had been much more interested in 20th century buttons that were more connected with the art of making buttons. And she had, I know from talking to someone who attended this auction in 1994, when the remains of what was left in Henri Hamm's workshop, which apparently had just been packed up at his when he died, and packed up and packed away for like 30 years. His family just finally decided they were getting rid of it in 1994, and there was this big auction in Paris. And Madame de Villefranche attended the auction and bought a lot of buttons by Allio. So there are some things, and all of these photos are from the auction catalog, the Couteau Bégari auction house in Paris, which does a lot of work with fashion and fashion accessories. So these photos are courtesy of them from their auction catalog. And it was things, you know, really things that we don't see so much. And so I really did want to share those with you, just as an example of why I get so excited about Henri Hamm. And just, you know, I was at the auction in 2019. I bought a lot of things, did not buy any Henri Hamm, sadly, for me. These two sample cards were just amazing, and we can see we have a good overview of Hamm's work, including his work with Casein. I mean, of course, not all of these buttons are Casein. There are several wooden examples. This is wood. These are wood with Casein as an OME. This is wood with a Casein inlay. But we see, you know, the carving and turning that he used, the Casein inlays with Casein. Remember, there's another wood example with Casein. Keep this design in mind with the two scarabs. We're going to look at that a little more closely in a bit. The one mystery is what these glass buttons are doing on these sample cards from Henri Hamm's workshop. That's remains unknown, because he's, you know, worked in a lot of different materials, you know, obviously Casein, horn, shell, more rarely ceramics, enamel, but, you know, he was not a glass blower, or so I'm not sure about those. But then, so that gives an overview, but there were some buttons that were so spectacular that I thought they deserved a closer look. These very scary spiders, these are on painted on a Casein that's been dyed. This sort of uneven surface dyed Casein is very typical of Henri Hamm. We'll see we'll see a little more about that in a minute too. It wasn't the only thing that he used, but it was common for him to use that. This is Casein with an imitation horn, sorry, with imitation, well, I wrote imitation faux tortoise or horn. Tonight it looks more like horn to me, but with a real piece of horn, because he did also work a lot with horn carved into kind of an owl face and set in. I don't remember what material the eyes were made of. Another fantastic spider button with Casein, again inlaid into the surface of the Casein button and then carved. And another one of Henri Hamm's crazy bugs. This one is, again, more like a beetle, and it almost looks, and again, I don't remember because, you know, it was over a year ago. It almost looks in the picture as if the eyes of the beetle are little black glass beads. I'm not sure about that. I don't remember. So those are the pictures from the auction catalog of this really exceptional work of Henri Hamm. I did put together a card. These are buttons that I actually do have. These four, so the top, these two on either side and the bottom, those are from another part of this workshop dispersal that came onto the market not so long ago in Paris, and fortunately they were bought by a member of the French Button Club who was very kind enough to share them. So, and again, we just see the different techniques, the carving and turning of the Casein. This one is over, it's a background. I'm not sure what the black material is, because it's the back is Casein, the front is Casein. There's a sheet of something black in there. I don't know what it is. But these smaller sizes are not that common. Actually, the larger sizes are ones that we're much more used to finding, and we're lucky enough to find anything by Henri. And finally, to end up, remember I was talking about the two on the sample cards, the two scarabs facing each other. I think this is probably an adaptation of that design into the shape of a buckle. And again, as I was mentioning with Henri, a lot of times he used this surface dyed casein, and here it's drilled back to the white color inside to make the eyes of the scarabs. So a fun buckle by Henri. And we will move on from Henri to Roger Semama, who's another button designer from the sort of the interwar years that we talk about a lot in France. I'm not sure how well known he is in the US. But when you read the people he worked with, and here we have another good French term for you, a parurier is someone who makes small fashion accessories. So costume jewelry, buttons, buckles, clips, those kinds of things, working very closely with the high fashion industry. And when you read the list of names that Semama worked with, Jacques Fat, Balmain, Schiaparelli, Lanvin, Givenchy, Balenciaga, Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, it's really like a who's who of fashion in France in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And his work is known, as you can see. A lot of his jewelry designs for Saint Laurent can be found both in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Musée de la Mode de la Ville de Paris. So they're he is a well-respected designer, and we can have very reasonably priced examples of his work that is literally museum quality. So this is just a little sample showing, and I want to show these buttons from the side because they come back to what I was saying earlier about the techniques. So we can see that these buttons are carved into the extruded rods of casein, and that these were made from the extruded tubes of casein. He just took a slice of the tube, carved the surface, put a sewing hole here in the bottom. You can just see where the wire is in this one. And there were the buttons. So again, you know, handmade, artisanal, reasonably affordable, but very lovely and really art. And you know, just to finish up with Semama, this is Loïc. This is a photo from Loïc Allio. He's always very careful about, because you know he didn't buy this from the workshop of Semama, but he's handled enough that I'm very comfortable with his attribution to say that this buckle in imitation jade and pastes was also by Semama as part of his work as a parurier. Another design team that I wanted to talk about that we talk about a little bit less maybe is La Maison Ardor, who were working in the early part of the 20th century. And the company was started by Victor Greidenberg, and then he was later joined by his partner, René Le Marchand. They made buttons in all kinds of different materials. And René Le Marchand was particularly well known for his work with leather and adapting leather to making buttons. But I found this quote, and I just thought this was, you know, when it comes to costume jewelry and dress trims, a collection like Greidenberg's represents the most direct expression of cubism in the applied arts, which was quoted in Loïc's first book, Boutons. And I think, I mean, when you see these buttons and these very abstract Art Deco shapes and forms and geometry, I think it's just an amazing connection between, you know, the history of big A art, which I'm not a huge fan of using that kind of terminology because it sounds as if we're relegating decorative arts and fashion to some kind of lower level of art history, which is not my intention. But this was really a reflection of what was going on in the art world in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, Ardor, not every button by Ardor is made of casein. They did not want to make our lives easier. We'll have a look at the typical shank that they used for casein buttons, but also for other plastics as well, celluloid notably. But and the Maison Ardor basically ended with World War II. Greidenberg had to flee France to the United States, and he never came back. He stayed in the United States after the war. So the Ardor is definitely pre-war. Another artist who people are very, very familiar with and who they may not associate with Casein is Marie-Christine Pavone. But I wanted to include her in this presentation because she is someone who was very much inspired to work with Casein and always said that it was her favorite material to work with. And she would seek out old stock Casein buttons to do her paintings on at first. As those buttons became harder and harder to find and more expensive to buy as a raw material, she did eventually move on to working with other kinds of plastics. And of course, her buttons that were mass produced, the sets that people are very familiar with, that have the German back mark, the UPF Création Pavone, those are a different kind of plastic. But when she was really choosing her materials that she wanted to work with, Casein was always her first choice. And so you always, you can't just automatically say that a button by Marie-Christine is Casein, but if you look at it, you can be sure, and you can make that determination. This one, I think I'm pretty safe in saying is Casein, because again, looking from the phone number, this is a very outdated Paris phone number. This would have been before 1985, I believe. So this is an old button by, or at least an old card by Marie-Christine Pavone, who did really appreciate Casein. So those are some of the artists that we're familiar with because there have been quite a few things written and published about them. I did want to also talk about some people who are less well known. And if you have read A Button Odyssey, Loïc mentions in that book a very mysterious artist or artisan whose name we don't even know. We know his last name was Le Pen, and we know that his niece somewhere in France owns what was left from his workshop of buttons and buckles that he created in the pre-war period. And she sometimes will let a few things go here and there. And Loïc has a connection with that through someone who knows her. It's all very tenuous. But I think this is a subject that is ripe for research. I think it would be great to know more about the person who created this crazy button. If we look at the musical staff and the notes, and I think this is a violin bow, and of course the scary eye, and it's very surrealist almost, if we wanted to make that connection again between big A art and fashion art. I think he's a very interesting person to learn more about for people who are inclined to do research. And I was talking to Loïc about him not so long ago, and he said, oh, I just got this. He got a, this is a button that has been transformed into a buckle in the workshop at some point. Apparently it didn't sell as a button. Who could understand why not? And he thought it would work better as a buckle, and sadly it remained unsold. Well, sadly for him, luckily for us, it remained unsold in his workshop. So we have just another example of this very extravagant, colorful carving on Casein that was done by the mysterious Mr. Le Pen. Another person who's not so well known that I want to talk about is Marc Cortés. And this is another workshop that, for whatever reason, the contents of the workshop have been hidden away until the last 2 or 3 years. These things have been coming onto the market in and around Paris. And they are sample cards of lots of different things. Again, and someone else who didn't work exclusively with Casein. Here we have an example of a brooch, very strong Art Deco geometric representation of an arrow with just a little Casein jewel on it. But I wanted to include this one because it does have very clearly, the name and the address of the workshop. And there are fabulous sample cards of Art Deco enamel buckles. My other examples, these are, again, Casein that has these very interesting Art Deco designs. So because of the material I've seen that's coming from this workshop, it doesn't seem to date from after World War II. So I suspect maybe the workshop was closed up in 1939 or 40, and the contents have just been sitting in someone's attic or basement or barn since then. And Mr. Cortés, who knows whatever happened to him. But I think, again, for people who like research, this would be a great project for somebody. And one last research project. This is one of the most spectacular, beautiful pieces of Casein work I've ever had the pleasure of handling this wonderful buckle. I mean, if you just look at the movement and the power in the carving of these Casein horses, I think it's very spectacular. And it's signed very tantalizingly, very clearly signed R. Michel. So trying to find information about R. Michel in France, it's like trying to find information about J. Smith. It's just, you know, I haven't been able to find anything. And I have really, you know, and of course I've talked about it with Loïc, who doesn't know who this person is either. And it's a mystery. And so, you know,